There is a man in a parking lot outside a distribution warehouse in southeast Texas right now. He drives a forklift for 8 hours a day, earns $17 an hour, and has done everything that society told him to do. He shows up on time. He doesn't call in sick. He pays his bills. And every night, he climbs into the back seat of his Chevy Malibu and tries to sleep before his next shift begins. He is not an anomaly. He is a signal. And the signal is getting louder. We are going to talk about something today that most people think they already understand. They don't. They have a picture in their heads, a tent encampment, a street corner, a city far away, and that picture is both real and wildly incomplete. Because while that image captured part of the story in the past, the crisis in 2026 has moved beyond anything that picture can contain. It's in the suburbs. It's in small towns in the rural Midwest. It's in the parking lots of hospitals and schools. And the people living it are not who you have been led to believe. By the time this is over, you will understand not just who is homeless in America right now, but why the number is almost certainly far larger than anything you've been told, why the federal safety net designed to catch people is being dismantled at the worst possible moment, and why the distance between your life and this crisis is much shorter than you think. Let's start with the official count. In 2024, the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development released its annual point-in-time count, a single-night census conducted in January by volunteers who go out and count people they can physically see. The result: 771,480 people experiencing homelessness. That was an 18% increase over 2023, and the highest number ever recorded in the modern tracking era. Preliminary estimates from 2025 suggest the number may have edged down slightly, to approximately 755,000, based on early data compiled by Community Solutions from 170 reporting communities. If confirmed, it would be the first meaningful decline after years of sharp increases. So is that progress? Possibly. But here's what those numbers don't tell you. That count happens on one night. Once a year. In January. It captures people visible enough to be found, those in shelters, in tents, in doorways. What it does not count are the millions of Americans living in what researchers call hidden homelessness. People doubling up in a cousin's apartment with nowhere else to go. People cycling through motels week to week. People sleeping in their cars, their vans, their RVs, scattered across parking lots in ways that no volunteer walking a city block at midnight could ever find. The U.S. Department of Education, which tracks homeless students under a broader legal definition that includes all forms of housing instability, identified over 1.3 million public school children as homeless in a single academic year. Just the children. That number alone already exceeds every version of the official national adult count. Those children live in vehicles, motels, and severely overcrowded homes, and they are systematically excluded from the housing statistics that drive federal funding and policy decisions. So the true scale of housing instability in this country isn't 755,000. That's just the visible edge. The fuller picture, when you fold in those who lack stable, safe, adequate housing but don't appear in a nighttime count, involves millions of Americans. And the gap between what we officially acknowledge and what is actually happening on the ground has enormous consequences. When the numbers look manageable, the response stays small. When the real scale is hidden, the resources allocated stay insufficient. The undercount isn't a rounding error. It is, in the most literal sense, a policy failure. The most common assumption about homelessness is that it starts with unemployment. That somewhere in the story, a person lost their job, and the job loss led to everything else. In many cases that's true. But data from shelters and local housing organizations across the country is documenting something that should fundamentally change how we think about this crisis. A growing share of homeless Americans have jobs, sometimes full-time ones, sometimes 2 or 3 of them. Southeast Texas saw a 61% increase in homelessness in recent years. Rhode Island, 35%. Northeast Tennessee, 20%. In each of these places, shelter workers and researchers noted the same thing: more employed people showing up without housing. In Tulsa, where homelessness rose 26%, the primary reason people gave was not mental illness, not addiction, not unemployment. It was the simple, structural absence of affordable housing. Consider what the arithmetic actually looks like. The National Low-Income Housing Coalition's most recent out-of-reach report found that in no state and no county in the United States can a full-time worker earning the state or local minimum wage afford to rent a modest 2-bedroom apartment. Not one. Not a single jurisdiction in the country. In fact, the average minimum wage earner would need to work 113 hours per week, nearly 3 full-time jobs, to afford that 2-bedroom rental. A 22-year-old Amazon worker near Nashville documented in reporting from 2024 earned $21 an hour, worked 50 hours a week, and still lived in his mother's SUV. The math wasn't complicated. Wages went up, but rents went up faster. Much faster. Between 2020 and 2024, national average rents rose between 30 and 40%. In cities like Miami, Phoenix, Tampa, and Austin, that figure was 50 to 70% in just 4 years. Wages rose too, but only 15 to 20% for most workers. That gap is not an accident. That gap is the mechanism. It's the precise mathematical reason millions of working households got pushed off the edge. When someone who is employed full-time cannot secure a roof over their head, homelessness stops being a social welfare problem. It becomes an economic measurement. A number telling you how far wages and housing costs have diverged. And right now, in 2026, that number is telling us something very serious. Here's what the public discourse on homelessness almost always gets wrong. It focuses on the most visible population, unsheltered adults with complex histories, substance use disorders, severe mental illness, and then generalizes that image to everyone. The data says that picture represents a real subset of the crisis, but not the dominant one. Families with children are a substantial and growing part of this population. Federal education data identifies over 1.3 million students in housing instability every year. Many of these families never appear in traditional homeless counts because they're deliberately trying not to be seen. They couch surf. They share apartments with relatives in already cramped spaces. They keep their children enrolled in the same school even after moving out of district, because stability for their kids is the one thing they're fighting to preserve. School districts across the country have quietly become frontline responders to a housing crisis, providing meals, arranging transportation, distributing hygiene supplies, functions they were never funded or designed to perform. The most striking demographic shift, though, is happening at the other end of the age spectrum. Seniors are now the fastest-growing homeless population in the United States. According to HUD's 2024 point-in-time count, approximately 146,150 people aged 55 and older were experiencing homelessness, roughly 20% of the total. The U.S. Interagency Council on Homelessness describes people aged 50 and older as having grown from about 10% of the homeless population to nearly half over the past few decades. Projections suggest the number of older adults experiencing homelessness could nearly triple in major cities by 2030. Why is this happening to people who spent their lives working, paying into systems, doing everything right? The math is brutal in its simplicity. The average monthly Social Security payment is around $1,700. Average monthly rent in most American cities now exceeds that figure. There is no gap to close. There is no combination of choices that makes those two numbers work without additional income or significant subsidy, and for millions of older Americans, neither exists. Once displaced, seniors face recovery barriers far more severe than younger people encounter. Nearly half of homeless adults over 55 live unsheltered, in places not meant for human habitation. Their health deteriorates faster. Their mortality rises sharply, and outreach systems designed for younger adults often fail to reach them at all. In 2024, over 3.5 million households faced eviction risks across the United States, with filings running 12% above pre-pandemic levels. This isn't just a statistic about a bad situation. It's a description of how the bad situation accelerates and compounds. An eviction record follows a person through the rental market for up to 7 years. A single filing, even one that was contested, even one that never resulted in actual removal, can disqualify someone from renting in most competitive housing markets. A person who gets their income stabilized within months of an eviction filing can still find themselves locked out of housing for years simply because the record exists. They applied, they were rejected, they tried again, they were rejected again. The system designed to resolve landlord-tenant disputes has become a mechanism for permanently marking people as undesirable renters, regardless of what happened afterward. And increasingly, filings are not a last resort. In high-demand rental markets, landlords have used eviction filings as a tool to clear long-term tenants and reset rents for new ones at market rate. Each filing pushes more people into instability faster than any assistance program can absorb them. The pipeline from housed to unhoused, once a slow-moving disaster, has become efficient and fast. Here's where 2026 is different from any previous point in this story. The crisis was already outpacing the response. Now the response is being actively reduced. In November 2025, the Trump administration released changes to the federal government's largest homelessness funding program, the Continuum of Care, which funds shelters, permanent supportive housing, and a wide range of services nationwide. The changes were unprecedented in scope. They included a 30% cap on permanent housing investments, conditions that would have required organizations to discriminate against transgender people, and a redirect away from the evidence-based housing-first model toward temporary shelter approaches that research has consistently shown produce worse outcomes. The National Low-Income Housing Coalition estimated that the changes would put at least 170,000 people at risk of homelessness. Over 166,000 units of permanent supportive housing would lose funding, disrupting placements for more than 218,000 people. States where over 70% of shelter beds rely on federal funding, places like Louisiana, Missouri, Ohio, and Maine, were facing potential collapse of their entire homeless service infrastructure. A federal judge blocked those changes in December 2025, and HUD reinstated the original funding plan in January 2026. But the administration's FY 2026 budget proposal, submitted in May 2025, proposed cutting HUD's overall budget by more than 50%. It proposed eliminating the Continuum of Care program entirely, eliminating the Housing Opportunities for Persons with AIDS program, eliminating community development block grants, and eliminating emergency vouchers that currently house thousands of families fleeing domestic violence and human trafficking. These people will die, said U.S. Representative Mike Quigley during a June 2025 budget hearing. There's no way you can believe a 50% cut won't put people on the street. When the Secretary of HUD was pressed for specifics on how those cuts would prevent increases in homelessness, none were provided. The federal government currently spends approximately $4.5 billion annually on homeless services, a figure already estimated to be only 12% of what is actually needed. Cutting it in half, while the population experiencing homelessness sits at record levels and the affordable housing shortage has grown 30% since 2020, does not require sophisticated modeling to understand. It requires only arithmetic. When the national conversation turns to homelessness, it turns almost exclusively to cities. Los Angeles, New York, Seattle, San Francisco. And while those cities have severe, visible crises, the fastest percentage increases in chronic homelessness over the 2023 to 2024 period were not in urban areas. They were in rural and suburban ones, 21.6% and 12.7% respectively, according to the National Alliance to End Homelessness. Rural homelessness is structurally different from its urban counterpart, and those differences make it harder to see and harder to address simultaneously. People sleeping in cars along agricultural roads don't appear in any count. People staying in unheated sheds, rotating among relatives' homes, or living in broken-down RVs off county highways are not being tracked by any system. The National Alliance estimates that only 5% of homeless individuals in rural areas access community support services, compared to 30% in urban areas. A person experiencing housing instability in a rural county may have no emergency shelter within 50 to 100 miles. The job market is often seasonal. Public transportation doesn't connect the places people need to reach. When formal systems don't exist, the default response is law enforcement, which means criminalization rather than support, and outcomes that make recovery harder. Local governments often deny the problem exists because it isn't concentrated enough to be visible. Meanwhile, rural schools, community health clinics, and churches quietly report rising demand for emergency assistance every single week. This isn't a phenomenon created by conditions unique to dense cities. It's the result of housing costs disconnecting from wages across the entire country, in every kind of community, simultaneously.